Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have our final panel of day one, The Way We Live, Updated Approaches to Climate Change in partnership with Ocean Elders. You are welcome to submit questions in the Q&A tab under the chat. I will now hand things off to our moderator, Jane King. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sophia, and welcome to the panel. Very exciting, and we have a very impressive group of panelists here today. So let me introduce everybody, and then we'll get started. We've got Captain Don Walsh, retired from the U.S. Navy, ocean elder, oceanographer, explorer, ocean engineer as well. Duncan Johnston-Watt, the co-founder and CEO of Blockchain Technology Partners. Anya Nova, crypto economist and business development power ledger. And Stan Shen, the CEO of Recycle Go Inc. So welcome, everybody. And it's obviously a very important topic that we're going to be talking about. There's a lot of global issues, a lot of political issues here. So let's just start and dig right in. So if I could let's start with Don at the top, and a quick thought from each of you. What are your main concerns when it comes to climate change? Don, go ahead.
Well, my main concern is what climate change is doing to the oceans. In that it affects just about every important aspect of the world ocean. It is essentially sort of the main concern we as oceanographers have as to what the downstream effects are with climate change and how the oceans are changing as a result of that. And of course, it's inexorable because Mother Nature moves slowly but inexorably, and we're beginning to see these changes in the ocean. We can't turn them around. What we've got to do as a world civilization is learn how to adjust to that and use the oceans intelligently, and at the same time seeing if we can initiate measures that we're all concerned with, that we can at least slow down global warming, or perhaps even stop it. That's too ambitious, perhaps, but that's my big concern. What is it doing to the ocean?
Thank you, Don. And Stan, what are your thoughts? What are your biggest concerns?
Well, I actually agree with Don, especially when it comes to climate change and ocean warming. For me, my perspective is the fact that we're producing 400 million tons of plastics every year, and we have 11 million tons of plastics that are being leaked into the oceans every single year. So especially when it comes to just life underwater, we have to also consider like just ocean life and around the issue of climate change as well.
And Duncan, what about you?
So taking a slightly different tack, obviously I agree with what the previous speakers just said, but I'm looking at this from the point of view of how do we feed, how do we handle the changes, the climate changes and the impact on things like agriculture, and how do we build in some climate resilience, in addition to obviously trying to address and slow down the rise in carbon emissions and so on. So it's how do we deal with what we're facing? How do we ensure that the food supply is not completely disrupted?
Okay, and then Anya, as a crypto economist, how do you see, what are your concerns, and then how do you see crypto and blockchain helping to solve this issue?
My main concern is that I think future generations might not have the same experience of life on this planet as we do, and that makes me really sad, because I'm just thinking of the kids growing up and just maybe not seeing some of the same birds or animals or fish that we're used to seeing, and having only to read about them in the books. And I think that's just, if you imagine that, and there's a few really good sci-fi books written about the world that kind of help you fully embrace yourself in that vision and go, well, what would it be like for future people? I think that's just, really sad, and that's my main concern about climate change. I think blockchain has a really big role to play in the orderly integration of renewables into the electricity system. And I can talk about that later. I think it's a fundamental piece of technology that's going to help promote the adoption of renewables.
Okay. And then one thing I know as we study this and talk about it is it really has to be a global solution. It doesn't do good if the US does something and Asia doesn't, and this really has to be. So how do we get there? Let's just go, everybody share their thoughts. Don, we can start with you again. I mean, how do we get there, especially with the oceans, because we share so much of that?
Well, I could simplify it all by saying what we tell our children, and that is play nice with others. The United States, regrettably, is in the current political situation, is not playing well with others. And I do think that considering the size of our science and engineering and economic, and by almost any metric, we should be right in the front row helping lead. And I'm afraid we have not done a good job. No, I'm not. I know we have not done a good job as a scientist and an oceanographer. And we have to get back to the international fora and exercise leadership. And that leadership is both by moral suasion, if you wish, but also injecting a considerable amount of funds into getting back to where we ought to be. You know, the train has left the station. That's the bottom line. And we now have to learn how to adjust to, as they say today, the new normal. And that's going to be tough because everything we do is affected by the oceans, and the oceans are affected by global warming, climate change, and all of that. So play nice with others.
Okay. And Stan, I mean, any ideas how we get there? I mean, we've talked about political things. I mean, do we need to go back to the table with another solution, another proposal?
Well, I think right now our world is definitely experiencing really not even well, definitely fundamental shifts in the way we do things, the way we live, and the way we're definitely being affected by climate change. I mean, if you look at 2019 being the hottest year on record, and it's obviously basically it's a trend. It's a very consistent trend in terms of our carbon emissions, in terms of our global temperatures, ocean temperatures, these kind of sunny day, tidal events, extreme weather patterns, these supposed 1,000-year events happening on a more regular basis, right? I mean, look at Hurricane Sally right now with our flooding in the Alabama area. Okay, these things are a common everyday occurrence. Now, what we're doing about this, how are we adapting to these kind of fundamental shifts in how the world behaves, how the world exists is, I think we're experiencing it. We are definitely adapting to it. Businesses are figuring out new business models, trying to work around it. You have insurance companies really obviously having higher insurance premiums for coastal regions at this point. There is at this point we have a lot of businesses realizing trying to figure out new economic models and new valuations. So I'm encouraged that the climate change is forcing us to really reevaluate how we allocate our capital, and also for blockchain use cases, really going into just redefining what social behaviors are good, and placing a valuation on that. For me, it's going to be recycling. My focus on the business has been around recycling.
Right. Yeah. And Duncan, working in the blockchain sector, is blockchain playing any role, at least on a large scale, in terms of helping reduce climate change? And if not, how could it?
So let's be clear. Blockchain is an enabling technology. So in and of itself, it's not going to solve anything. I think it's really how do we apply this technology, and more importantly, how do we apply things like smart contracts, which are now emerging as being, if you like, the new frontier. So instead of focusing just on the lower level ledger protocols, let's look instead at how we can make good use of smart contracts. So a good example of that, there was a session earlier in the day looking at how do we standardize carbon credits. And one of the interesting things about that was you look at the supply and the demand for this. The demand, if Microsoft is successful in terms of going carbon negative by 2030 and then actually essentially offsetting all of its carbon consumption since it was founded in 2050, there isn't enough supply side carbon credits at the moment to meet that. So technology isn't going to solve that problem. Technology can enable processes. It can ensure, for example, that carbon credits are verified, and so it's part of that process of ensuring that you don't get double spend in the case of a carbon credit, which would be criminal, clearly. So it has a role to play there. Before we dive into blockchain, though, I would like to sort of add that I'm still optimistic, and the reason I say that is in the midst of the pandemic, we have seen, albeit everyone is saying it's temporary, that action at scale can make a difference. And I'm talking about the fact we all ended up like I'm like many of us, always on a plane, and suddenly I'm not on a plane. Well, it's not ideal from an economic point of view that we all sit at home, but it did show that action at scale can affect or change things, which I think is important, sends an important message to people, because sometimes as an individual, it's hard to see how you can make a difference. So if nothing else, some good has come out of the pandemic in that it has shown that actually, if we're coordinated, and this is back to your point about we need to do this on a global scale, then we can affect change. So I would share that.
And well, that's interesting point, because it shows that we do have some control still over this. So Anya, you're in Australia. Do you want to share your thoughts from an Asian point of view in terms of where we are with this and what needs to be done?
Yes, sure. And I'd like to add something that Duncan brought up. It's super important around the carbon credits and blockchain technology. So the way the carbon credits and renewable energy certificates have worked today was that the accounting was done on an annualized basis. So a carbon credit or renewable energy certificate that represents 1 megawatt hour of generation from a renewable plant was counted just the same if it was produced in the middle of the day or if it was produced at night. And that's clearly not correct, and not the way that procurement processes for those credits will go on in the future. Because during the day, we might have excess generation, lots of PV panels, large solar farms generating energy. A lot of that energy is actually not being consumed. So it's not displacing the carbon intensive fuels. Sometimes we even have government incentive programs that mean that people have to shut off that clean renewable generation. When you really need renewables is around 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m. when people come home and turn on all of their appliances at the same time. So I think what we're seeing is blockchain facilitating a better accounting method for renewable certificates and equating generation against consumption in real time. That means that energy, renewable energy produced in the evening, whether with the help of household batteries or large battery systems or wind, are going to start being worth more than energy that's produced in the middle of the day, offsetting more of the carbon intensity of the grid. And blockchain technology comes in to this picture by enabling a very granular accounting mechanism and an audit trail, so that as a Microsoft or eBay or whoever that is that's buying that credit, I can actually not just buy an annualized amount of credits I might need for that year, but I can match my credit profile with my load profile at the time and do a better job.
Interesting. Okay, so Don, and I think I kind of know the answer to this, but do we need buy-ins from government? Can this be totally private sector? How will this look? The perfect solution, how will it look, and who will be the player?
Well, Jane, recall that the governments, by and large, are us and the people in most places. And the big thing, and if you want to reduce this to a single phrase, it's a marketing problem. Until we create an extensive global awareness of people's as to the importance of global climate change, we're not going to get very far because leaderships and such, and the parliaments and our Congress, they respond to what people want. And also, of course, the lobbyists representing various commercial groups and such and political aims. But we have to learn how to market the importance of it. Right now, what's happening is global climate change is happening to us. I mean, I'm in Oregon, the whole state's on fire. 10% of the population of Oregon is evacuating. 1 million acres burned. And I'm sitting here wreathed in smoke, even though it's the nearest fire is about 100 miles away. And hurricanes are racing across the Gulf Coast into the United States, and there's 4 or 5 others out there. It is happening to us, but we are not anticipating or leading it. Yes, the science can predict these events, but until we achieve universal, international, global change, what do you want to call it, give it a nice term, awareness, we're not going to, the peoples of the world being proactive and pressuring their parliaments and our Congress to affect these changes. And it can't be left to those of us who are so-called experts in this area. We don't have a big enough stick and a loud enough voice. So it is a marketing problem. How do we sell this awareness, environmental awareness, to the world? Right now, they're only aware when the water's coming up around their ankles, or they get struck by lightning, or choke on the smoke. And that's not satisfactory. We have to get out in front of these problems, and you do that by bringing people into this and convincing them that every one of them has to be active and interested in what's going on. It's in your own self-interest, world. It's in your own self-interest.
And Stan, Don brought up a good point. I was going to actually bring up Oregon. I have some friends who live in Portland, and they're going to work with gas masks on, like full-on gas masks. So, Stan, this has become so political, and I feel like, you know, we watch these things happen on the West Coast and in the Gulf, and we know it's unusual, and I mean, but it feels like it's so political, and sides aren't trusting each other. I mean, how do we even begin to solve that problem?
Oh, I'm not sure I have the answer for that. The way I see it is, we really have to not attack this issue as a divisional issue, right? Like, you know, climate change is happening. For me, on a personal level, I actually just finished training for Al Gore's Climate Reality Leadership Corps recently, and just obviously on a personal level, I definitely do believe climate change is happening. Look, that argument with the climate deniers, I really don't want to engage in. However, I do want to engage in, obviously, how can we collaborate given the new realities, right? I mean, the new reality is like, you know, for me, like August 31st represents a very pivotal moment in history for me. That was the day that ExxonMobil, once considered the world's most valuable company, got delisted from the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right? I mean, this represents a seminal shift in underlying, from linear to circular economies, from a fossil fuel based economy to sustainable business models. Like, let's face it, you know what, if you make sustainability, if you make SDGs profitable, if you optimize these kind of sustainable recyclable supply chains, businesses will follow. So you have to, blockchain is extremely pivotal in really being able to supply this data that companies can make these kind of decisions. I'm very, very encouraged about where this world is going, where we're evolving in terms of our business models, and how blockchain plays a part in this.
Okay, and Duncan, you're in Scotland, right?
Yep, I am indeed.
How is the Scottish government or the UK? I mean, do they understand blockchain and its potential in this area, or even in general?
Scotland, I would say, I would distinguish as being separate from England. We're still part of the United Kingdom, by the way, just now. But what I mean by that is that we've been studying what Estonia has been doing in terms of, and Estonia is really a tremendous sort of use case for blockchain as applied to citizens and being used in a good way. But I think to your earlier point, whatever we do in Scotland won't make a dime of difference if we're not actually acting in concert. And so, in fact, we already have, to Don's point, we already have the Paris Accord. We already have, well-intentioned statements. It's about moving beyond that and actually doing something which has become an actual movement called Build Back Better. So this is something that Jonathan Porritt has popularized. It's even been used in the upcoming presidential elections, although I hasten to add this is not a political, nor should it be a political thing, but Build Back Better is saying we're going to have to invest. And this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to reinvest. And I'm very keen to know what Anya thinks about this. Reinvest in things like renewables, in things like the circular economy, in things like making ESGs a good investment, not just a good thing. And so I think the Build Back Better movement has got me thinking that this, if we can in any way, shape or form as technologists support that, that's what we should be doing.
Anya, do you want to respond to Duncan?
Yes, I agree that we need to invest, but we need to invest in a smart way. What we've seen happening in some countries is that first we have a subsidy that incentivizes people to install rooftop solar, and then we have new subsidies that incentivize people not to use the rooftop solar that they have installed, and that is a waste of money. So we need to provide a price signal to the market to invest in renewables at a particular time, in a particular location, under certain conditions. And I'll just give you a quick example of what I mean. So renewables, since sustained growth, lots of people installed PV. I think in Perth, we're close to about a quarter to a third of households have a PV system. But then what happens is, too much generation in the middle of the day, not enough consumption, and it reverts in the evening. So something I mentioned before. And what that means is that you either have a shortfall of energy in the system, which is met by a peaking plant, which burns petroleum-based products, or you have too much renewable generation during the day, and that means that generation gets cut off through various subsidies as well. And obviously not a very orderly integration of a super important energy source. Now, of course, the difference between renewables and fossil fuels is that fossil fuels, you turn on the nuclear reactor or coal-fired power plant and it operates in a very precise and consistent way, where renewables are a lot less precise, but there is a way to deal with them. So I think the way to deal with them is really by aggregating multiple households and giving them a price signal for when and where they should be investing in batteries. And it might seem a bit of a fantasy, but we've actually run a trial on that to demonstrate that it's possible. So in the city that I live, which is the city of Fremantle, we onboarded 48 households into a localized energy market and allowed them to set their own buy price for energy and their own sell price for energy. So that's the energy that's being produced in a renewable way within the community. And what we found is that it does provide the right kind of signal for families with the right consumption to buy a battery. And once they have a battery and they can use that battery to do energy arbitrage, so buy when prices are low, sell when high, or when they can use that battery to participate in network control services or frequency control services, they can pay it off much, much faster. So you're actually allowing people to invest rather than investing at a larger scale.
Okay. Now, I'm going to throw a term out, and whoever wants to tackle this can, or numerous, carbon capture. What is that? How can this be used? Who wants to go first?
Could I go first?
Duncan, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are around about half a dozen ways of capturing carbon, and they range from things that ultimately might be regarded as goofy because they're capturing the carbon, but the actual process of capture is itself, incredibly intensive in terms of using, precious resources like water, through to things that are, I think, sustainable, like regenerative farming techniques. So, as I said or hinted at in the opening remarks, this is something where if we actually adopt a different farming techniques, we can over time capture carbon in the soil. And it's a natural process called photosynthesis. So it's not like we've got to go and invent a new process. This has been around since forever. But it only works if you can actually verify the results, not just one time, but over time, because the kind of projects, and Australia has some of these, I know for sure, some of these projects, minimum lifetime of a project is 25 years. And that's been reduced now from, I think it was 100 years originally. So that means you've got to not just do a one-time measurement, you're going back and measuring that the carbon is genuinely being captured over time. And in order to do that, you've also got to maintain the veracity of not just the data, but the samples. So you're then commingling things like track and trace with so using blockchain for that, as well as using blockchain to actually ensure that the data and the contracts that manage that data are also secure. And so in that way, you don't get the double spend problem. So you have verified carbon credits, but it begins with soil carbon capture in the soil. So instead of farm to fork, this is carbon capture leading right the way through to carbon credits and carbon markets.
Duncan,
so that's the most interesting one, I think, personally.
If you saw the story I saw today, Cargill, which is the U.S.'s largest agricultural company, is going to start using regenerative farmers, and they're making them prove their biodiversity and things like that. And then I also saw this week Wrangler Jeans is using farmers that do regenerative cotton farming. So I'm seeing more of that.
And there's a company in the States called Indigo Agriculture, or Indigo Ag, that's issued something called the Tetraton Challenge, which is trying to capture, using soil carbon capture, the entire carbon that we've emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this is something that's doable.
Yeah, it's happening, and there is a lot of private companies doing things. Don, I'd like you to weigh in on this. We've seen, I know Delta was working on being carbon neutral in 10, 15 years or something when COVID hit, and I think that kind of changed their priorities for a while. But Google has made efforts to run their data centers, solar, wind power, and Microsoft, Apple. How much do you think like private companies can do for this? And what can we do to encourage them to reimagine how they operate their business so they are more sustainable?
We asked me?
Yeah, Don, go ahead.
Well, all right. I think that perhaps the main line of attack from what I was talking about earlier, the marketing problem, is to work with these large corporations like Cargill, the large energy companies, because to a certain extent they're easier to deal with in affecting changes if it's in their own best interest. So everything you do has to be a win-win for both parties. That's very simple. Dealing with the global public as a whole is going to be very difficult. So I would focus first on the large corporations, and through such mechanisms as the carbon credits and tax advantages for them, help them move into a renewable energy area, which would then tend to reduce atmospheric pollutants. But having said that, I'm, as a person who spent a lot of his life in the polar regions over the last half century, I'm a little skeptical because the rate at which things are changing in the Arctic is warming up twice as fast as the rest of our planet. And that, of course, is uncovering and warming up the permafrost, which is an enormous source of methane, which is a far more damaging atmospheric or greenhouse gas than any of the others. And all these things we've been talking about allow us to move fast enough to get ahead of that and getting this feedback cycle in the Arctic, whereas the ice disappears off the Arctic Ocean, what used to be a mirror for incoming solar radiation now becomes an absorbent, and the ocean's warming faster. The more the ice goes away, the faster it warms. And then this is, of course, accentuated by the liberation of methane from the massive permafrost tracts across Siberia and Canada there. And I can get a little desperate when I think of how fast things are moving, because I've been going up there, as I said, for 50 years, and I've seen these changes. And you talk to the native peoples in Nunavut, and they're pretty good weather people because they're their name Inuit means people of the land, and they see these things. They're not very expressive. They're not bomb throwers. They're not revolutionaries, but they know where they used to hunt. They know where the food used to be. So this is a great drama, and Greenland now has had it. I'm just looking at a document here. A chunk fall off of Greenland that's about the size of Manhattan, and that, of course, acted as a snubber or a bumper, if you will, for the plastic ice uphill from the central part of Greenland, because it is always flowing. It's very plastic, but when it gets to the coastline, these large glaciers would tend to hold those in place, or at least slow down the rate of flow of the ice into the ocean, and that's going away. Same thing in the Antarctic. 2 huge glaciers there, or ice fields, are about ready to calve off and go into the ocean. And some of the dire predictions, and this is just wild stuff, the sea level might go up by 10 feet by the end of this century. We were talking earlier about a meter or two, a few feet going up of sea level rise, but we've been consistently wrong in predicting sea level rise. And now you get into, UN now has a committee on environmental refugees. I was talking a few years ago to the president of Kiribati in Oceania, one of the island states there, and he said that by the middle of century, and he's gone to the UN with this same idea, they're going to have to get up and leave. Think of that. The first time in the history of civilization, an entire country, population of countries, got to go somewhere else. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Thus
now,
ended
Stan, what kind of technology solutions could we have? And is this the kind of thing we really have to rely on? Millennials have pushed a lot of this with their consumer buying behavior, and Gen Z is getting older now. Are they going to be the ones that usher in this change?
Oh, I have high hopes that they will be. We have the emergence of the low-house consumer segment, the lifestyles on health and sustainability consumer segment, that really make their choices based on what you're doing, how sustainable your products are. I'm as going back to Don's point, I think that I am very, very worried about what's going on, and he's absolutely right in terms of what methane is. Something like an 80 something times more of a greenhouse gas than regular carbon dioxide, and we're releasing this with just obviously the tundra and with our methane flares from fossil fuel base energy production. But obviously I'm encouraged. I don't think we're moving fast enough. I think I heard somebody say, look, we're at a point in our civilization where we don't have to get our energy from the sun from stuff that's buried 5 miles down, right? We can take our energy from the sun directly from the sun itself. So it's actually really silly that we're actually going 5 miles deep to grab the sun's energy that's been locked up away for millions of years, right? So hopefully we can accelerate that move to a zero carbon economy. Hopefully we can integrate just really all of these are carbon capture technologies, and we can use blockchain as an incentivization mechanism to onboard these companies, these stakeholders, all these different stakeholders to engage in this process, and also to really show the millennials and the Gen Zs their impact in terms of their everyday decisions, in terms of what they're purchasing, which companies they're supporting, and what initiatives they're supporting. And it's all going to be transparent because of the blockchain.
Yeah, and I think that their consumer behavior and their choices have really made a difference. I mean, you see it in corporate America with a lot of the changes that are taking place, and it's going to, I think, have to come from a business level to be able to drive that. And they've been pretty successful doing that so far. So, but I think Duncan, one thing that I see a lot of, at least in the U.S., is people don't totally understand it. There's a lot of science. There's the ocean, and there's fossil fuels, and it kind of gets confusing. And then if we would blockchain into that, I can see people maybe being more confused because it's not really a widely understood concept yet in the United States. I mean, how do we start that education process to make sure that people know exactly what we're dealing with here?
I think so. I would for a start, I would stop talking about blockchain. I think this is again an important consideration. That let's look at the solutions. Let's look at what we can build using it, and view it as and indeed smart contracts as tools that enable us to build systems that have very interesting and useful characteristics in a decentralized or distributed environment where you're trying to do a lot of multi-party interactions. And as soon as you say blockchain at a dinner party or even smart contracts, it's like, oh God, here goes Duncan again. So not that I've been invited to many recently, but I blame that on COVID, not my personal demeanor. But no, seriously, I think let's look at what we can do. And Stan's right. I mean, I have a daughter who's 21, and she worked for Elle magazine on a year abroad. And you think of Elle as being, well, I thought of it as just, it's a fashion magazine. No. They're actually one of the leaders in terms of thought leadership around slow fashion, and they are absolutely changing people's attitudes. And so, it is definitely the case that there is certainly in the developed world a well understood, Extinction Rebellion. I mean, there's a well understood, a great understanding of the issues. What we need to do is figure out solutions. And Don is right. I mean, what he says is frankly, harrowing. The speed with which things are happening, which is why climate resilience ultimately is also part of this puzzle. Is how do we become more resilient while we're also trying to slow down the impact of climate change? We have to build into the system better resilience, and that includes the way in which we feed the world. I mean, so this is not just a developed world issue. This is a whole world issue.
Sure. Well, Anya, I get the feeling from what I hear is that Australia is much better, much further along than the U.S. is in terms of understanding this issue, taking it seriously. How did Australia get there?
Well, I think we're an island nation, so anything that happens here, we understand that there is no place for us to go. I think Australians really tend to be quite innovative and embrace technology. And to be honest, in terms of the energy transition towards renewables, a lot of those choices were made for economic reasons. So the manufacturing of PV panels got better, faster, they got cheaper. People just made an economic decision. So a PV system for a household pays off in just a number of years in Australia because we happen to have a very sunny climate. We also have a number of really serious blockchain companies based here who have set up various markets for transaction of energy. So Power Ledger, where I work, is one of them. And I think a big driver, just took your question earlier about what corporations can do in private enterprise. We obviously have the Renewable 100, which is the 250 large companies that have signed up to ensure that 100% of their energy consumption comes from a renewable source, whether it's by 2023 or 2025 or whatever that might be. And I think companies like that should be really celebrated and should be enabled. So if they want to ensure that 100% of their energy is renewable, they either sign direct contracts with wind turbines and solar farms, or they purchase the carbon certificates that we talked about. And we need to make that process as simple for them as possible. So right now, there is not really a seamless marketplace for transacting in those carbon credits. A lot of that is done through kind of who knows who, and we need to fix that. And that's where technology really comes into play.
We've got about 8 minutes left. I'd like for each of you to take 2 minutes and explain to me how you think the pandemic accelerated, delayed, changed the fight for climate change. So Don, if you could start and just kind of, what's your opinion about the pandemic and what kind of impact it had on this?
Oh, gee, out in the world ocean, there's not that many of us out there compared to the population of the entire world. So that's a tough one for me to answer. For example, the cruise ship industry has been just about wiped out. Those of you that follow the markets know that even the largest one, Carnival Group, is they just lost $3 billion last quarter. One quarter, just $12 billion a year in losses. We extrapolate that, and we see that the international shipping industry, ships are crews, the officers and crews can't get off because of virus restrictions in various ports throughout the world, and we see because of the pandemic and the economy that has crashed because of that, that the world petroleum industry is on hard times. This means tankers aren't running. Tankers are being rented to store surplus hydrocarbons, petroleum, and on and on. It's cascading through the entire. 98% of the world's goods are from producer to consumer go by sea, and that's all being wrecked. And so there's a cascading effect there of the shortages of shipments. And it's such a big question how it affects the oceans that I don't even feel adequate to fully address it. That would be a good seminar. At least 2 credits for a university.
And I'm sure we'll be talking about this for many years. Stan, your thoughts on the pandemic and its impact?
Well, for me, the pandemic obviously as a link in the plastics life cycle, the pandemic has definitely produced more PPEs, which are predominantly polypropylene based. So my concern right now is we're actually increasing the materials that are plastics that are being introduced into the waste stream and into the environment. The pandemic has forced us to really examine that, look at that, and try to find ways to actually deal with that kind of material stream. I'm happy to say we're activating a beach cleanup this weekend for International Cleanup Day on Saturday, where we will be taking, so we're working with Oceanic Global to take beach plastic that we're going to be cleaning up and converting that into essentially a building block from CRDC, which is amazing. We're tracking that material, but we obviously want to deal with plastics, especially in a post-COVID world, where we have increased plastics production, increased PPE coming into the waste stream, and really thinking about the process and really introducing blockchain to track the materials and to make sure we're engaged in not only the consumption of the product, but also the post-consumer, actions of the material itself. Mm-hmm. So I hope that we can just really just be cognizant and just be aware and be present always of just our everyday behavior and just measure our impact.
Right. No, that would make a huge difference. Just to don't use so much stuff. I mean, that's what I try to do. So, Duncan, thoughts about the pandemic? You mentioned earlier that that it did show that we could reduce our emissions. What do you think going forward? Have you learned a lesson?
Well, I personally have learned a lesson and realized that there is a different way of doing business to the way I've done it for the last 30 years. I still crave human contact in business, and I'm sure we'll get to a point where that will happen again. But at the same time, we're fortunate in the technology industry that we can continue to conduct our business and use technology to good effect. I am aware, though, and Stan's right, that it has put a hold on things like waste and recycling and so on, and so that's a downside. You asked earlier about I guess the UK. There are a couple of companies that I'm familiar with, Circular and Topolytics. So Circular is in the blockchain space, Topolytics, and they're looking at sort of tracking waste and so on. Topolytics is doing a lot of analytics, but we're teaming up with them to look at things like nuclear waste and how we can track that. So there's a lot of innovation, but back to the earlier point, action at scale is what is required, and it's taught us that is possible. But obviously the unintended consequences are sheer waste. I mean, we're talking about daily testing of people here in the UK, which is just a complete waste of time, money, and resources. I mean, I'm not. it just doesn't make sense. I mean, there has to be a better way of dealing with this.
Thank you, Duncan. And I think you mentioned a keyword, innovation. That's Anya, can you bring us home here in the last 2 minutes? What are your thoughts from the other side of the world in terms of pandemic and how it changed things?
I think one interesting side effect that we didn't expect was that it really equalized the playing field for smaller technology companies. So where before, as a technology company operating out of Australia, we were finding that it's harder to compete if you're trying to win business in the United States or Europe or elsewhere. Because if you're not there, you're just not front and center of mind. Mm-hmm. But no one's really front and center of mind. Everyone's doing all of their meetings on Zoom. So we really found that it doesn't matter so much where you're located anymore from an investment point of view or a business development point of view, as long as you can get that Zoom meeting, which is has been quite simple for us, really. You can get your I think what it's going to mean in the end is that the best technology solution will emerge. Mm. And then obviously it brought kind of climate change and renewable energy to the front of mind for many people, which I think is, if there is anything good that's going to come out of that, it had that impact.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it may have even changed some attitudes in terms of priorities in our life. Do we really need all this stuff? I mean, maybe hanging out with your family and friends is important too. So thank you so much. This has been very interesting. I want to thank Don Walsh, Duncan Johnston-Watt, Anya Nova, and Stan Chen for joining us today. So it was very thoughtful, and thank you for being generous with your time and knowledge.
Thank you, Jane. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, GBBC.
Thank you.
And build back better.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'd just like to remind everyone that's here that that this is the end of day one, but we will start up again tomorrow for day two. We start at 9 a.m. New York time. That's GMT-4, with opening remarks by Robert Opp. He's the Chief Digital Officer of the United Nations Development Program. And he will walk us through their digital and innovation strategy, as well as how they're handling the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.
Thanks.